Pearl Harbor Naval Base, October 1941. The smell hit you first. Before the Pacific sun turned the corrugated steel warehouses into ovens, before the diesel fumes from the harbor mixed with the salt air, before any of it, there was the smell of the cold storage unit at Warehouse 7. Potatoes going soft in their sacks, onions beginning their slow rot, the metallic tang of refrigerated meat hanging in the dark. Petty Officer 3rd Class Thomas Nakamura stood in the doorway at 0547 hours, clipboard in hand, and knew immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way a cook would notice. Spoiled food, broken seals, rodent droppings. Wrong in the way his father would have noticed back at Nakamura and Sons Grocers in Salinas, California, when the numbers in the ledger didn't match the goods on the shelves. Wrong in the way only someone who had spent his childhood learning to count inventory before he learned to read could understand. Someone had been here. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Thomas was 22 years old, 5'6", with the compact build of a man who had spent his teenage years hauling 50-pound sacks of rice and cases of canned goods. He had enlisted in the Navy 8 months ago, partly out of patriotism, partly to prove to people like Mrs. Henderson back in Salinas that Japanese Americans could be just as loyal as anyone else, and partly because the Navy paid better than the grocery business ever would. They had made him a cook. Of course they had made him a cook, but the Navy hadn't counted on one thing. Thomas Nakamura didn't think like a cook. He thought like an accountant who happened to work with food. He stepped into the cold storage unit, his breath forming small clouds. The temperature gauge read 38 degrees regulation. He moved down the first aisle, running his hand along the wooden crates stacked 6 high, apples from Washington, carrots from California, canned peaches from Oregon, everything labeled, everything dated, everything exactly where it should be, except it wasn't. Thomas pulled a small notebook from his pocket, a habit his father had drilled into him. You want to know where the money goes, Tommy? You write everything down, every day. Then you look for what doesn't fit. His father's English had never lost its Japanese accent, but his understanding of American commerce was flawless. Thomas flipped to yesterday's count. Canned peaches, 240 units. He counted the crates again. 231 units. 9 cans missing. He moved to the next section. Condensed milk logged at 180 cans. Actual count, 178. Rice, 25-pound sacks, logged at 40. Actual count, 39. Small discrepancies. The kind of thing that could be explained by clerical errors, by someone forgetting to log a requisition, by the general chaos of feeding 5,000 men on a naval base that was expanding faster than its paperwork could keep up. But Thomas had been noticing these discrepancies for 6 weeks now, and they were never random. They followed a pattern. Officers' Mess, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, 0815 hours. Nakamura, where the hell are my eggs? Chief Petty Officer Wallace was a 40-year-old career Navy man with a face like weathered leather and a voice that could strip paint. He ran the officers' mess with the efficiency of a German factory and the warmth of a Siberian winter. Thomas emerged from the storage room carrying 2 crates. Right here, Chief. Fresh delivery this morning. Fresh? Wallace cracked one open, held it up to the light, squinted. These are 3 days old if they're a day. Supplier's stamp says October 14th, Chief. That's yesterday. Wallace grunted, unconvinced, but moved on. He had bigger problems. The officers' mess was serving breakfast to 200 men in 45 minutes, and the new batch of Filipino stewards didn't know a poached egg from a hand grenade. Thomas returned to his station, a small desk wedged between the industrial refrigerators and the dry goods storage. It wasn't much, but it was his. The Navy had designated him supply coordinator for food services, which meant he did the job that no one else wanted to do. Tracking every can of beans, every sack of flour, every side of beef that came onto this base and into the stomachs of the Pacific Fleet. He pulled out his ledger. The official one, the one that the Navy inspectors looked at when they came through. Everything in it was accurate, cross-referenced, and signed off by Lieutenant Morrison, the supply officer who spent most of his time playing cards in the officers' club and signing whatever Thomas put in front of him. Then Thomas pulled out his other notebook, the unofficial one. He had started keeping it in early September, just a week after being assigned to Warehouse 7. At first it was simple curiosity, his father's training making him notice things that didn't add up. A requisition form for 60 pounds of coffee submitted by Barracks 12B when Barracks 12 only went up to 12A. A request for 30 gallons of fresh milk at 0200 hours on a Sunday morning signed by a Lieutenant Carpenter who, as far as Thomas could determine, didn't exist. Small things. Ghost requisitions. But ghosts, Thomas was learning, could be measured. He opened the notebook to a fresh page and began transcribing this morning's discrepancies. October 15th, 1941, peaches, canned, 9 units. Milk, condensed, 2 units. Rice, 25 bags, 1 unit. Then he flipped back through the previous entries. September the 8th, missing canned goods had coincided with the departure of 3 destroyers for maneuvers near Midway. September 22nd, discrepancies in meat inventory the day before the USS Pennsylvania had changed berths from Pier 7 to Pier 11. October 3rd, phantom requisitions for dry goods hours before a previously unannounced submarine drill. At first, Thomas had thought he was imagining it, seeing patterns where there were only coincidences. But he had grown up in a family that survived the Depression by understanding one fundamental truth. There are no coincidences in numbers. Numbers don't lie. People lie. Systems can be corrupted, but the numbers themselves, they just sit there waiting for someone patient enough to read them. And Thomas Nakamura was very, very patient. Warehouse 7, 15:30 hours. The afternoon sun hammered down on the warehouse complex like a physical force. Inside Warehouse 7, the temperature climbed to 95 degrees despite the open bay doors. Thomas had stripped down to his undershirt, his navy uniform jacket hanging on a hook that still smelled faintly of the paint it had been coated with 3 months ago when this warehouse was built. Everything about Pearl Harbor was new. New construction, new assignments, new ships arriving weekly as the Pacific Fleet consolidated in response to Japanese aggression in China and Indochina. The base was bursting at the seams, expanding so fast that half the time nobody knew who was supposed to be where, which made it the perfect environment for someone to hide. Thomas was filing requisition forms when he heard footsteps on the concrete. Heavy, confident, officer's boots. He looked up to see Lieutenant Morrison approaching, a cigarette dangling from his lips, sweat stains spreading across his khaki uniform. Nakamura. The Admiral's mess needs a full restock for Friday night. He's hosting some big shots from Washington. I need you to pull together a requisition list. The good stuff. Steaks, fresh vegetables, real butter. None of that margarine shit. Thomas nodded, reaching for a blank form. How many guests, sir? 20, maybe 25. Make it 30 to be safe. And the menu, sir? Morrison waved his hand dismissively. I don't know. Whatever rich people eat, you figure it out. Just make it look good. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Nakamura? Keep it off the books for now. Don't want some bean counter in Washington seeing that we're serving filet mignon while the Army's eating Spam. Off the books, sir. You heard me. Just pull it from general inventory. We'll square it up later. Morrison walked away, leaving a trail of cigarette smoke. Thomas stared at the blank requisition form. Off the books. He had heard that phrase 11 times in the past 6 weeks, always from Morrison. Always for special events that somehow never appeared in the official schedule. Always for quantities that didn't quite match the number of guests. Always logged to departments or barracks that, when Thomas checked, didn't seem to exist. He pulled out his unofficial notebook and added a new entry. October 15th, 15:30. Morrison. Admiral's Mess, Friday. 30 guests. Off the books. Note. Admiral Kimmel's official schedule shows him in Honolulu Friday night. Conference with Army Command. Thomas sat back, staring at the page. For 6 weeks he had been collecting data, watching, waiting, trying to convince himself that he was wrong, that he was being paranoid, that the son of Japanese immigrants shouldn't go around accusing American naval officers of what exactly? That was the problem. He didn't know what this was, but he knew it wasn't right. And he knew that in 3 days, the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington were scheduled to depart for exercises near Wake Island. He knew this because he had overheard 2 officers discussing it in the mess. He knew this because it was supposed to be classified information. And he knew that if the pattern held, if the ghost in his inventory followed the same rhythm it had followed for 6 weeks, there would be another phantom requisition tonight. Thomas closed his notebook and locked it in his desk drawer. Then he did something he had never done before. He decided to stay late. Warehouse 7, 22:45 hours. The base was quiet. Most of the men were in town, drinking at the bars on Hotel Street or taking in a movie at the Waikiki Theater. The skeleton crew on duty was scattered across 100 acres of naval facilities, too few men trying to watch too much ground. Thomas sat in the darkness of the warehouse office, a single desk lamp providing just enough light to read by. He had told Chief Wallace he was staying late to finish inventory reports. Wallace had grunted something about damn Japs and their paperwork and left him to it. The casual racism didn't sting anymore. Thomas had grown a thick skin back in Salinas, where signs in shop windows sometimes read "No Japs," and where his father had taught him to smile and bow and never, ever make white people uncomfortable. You want to survive in America, Tommy? You make yourself useful. You make yourself invisible. You do the job they don't want to do, and you do it better than anyone else. That's how we survive. His father's words, his father's strategy. But tonight, Thomas wasn't trying to be invisible. Tonight, he was hunting. At 23:17 hours, he heard it, the sound of a vehicle approaching, not the rumble of a delivery truck. Those didn't run this late. This was lighter, a staff car, maybe, or a Jeep. Thomas moved to the window, keeping to the shadows. He watched as a black sedan pulled up to the side entrance of Warehouse 7, the entrance that led directly to the cold storage units, bypassing the main office entirely. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted against the distant lights of the harbor. Even in the darkness, Thomas could see the officer's cap, the confident posture of someone who belonged here. The figure moved to the warehouse entrance, produced a key, and slipped inside. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. This was the moment when he either followed his instincts or convinced himself he was crazy. He grabbed his flashlight, clicked it off, and moved silently through the warehouse. Years of navigating his father's store in the dark, checking for rats, securing inventory after closing, had taught him how to move without sound. He heard the cold storage door open, heard footsteps inside, heard the rustle of paper. Thomas positioned himself behind a stack of crates, watching through a gap in the boxes. The figure was standing in front of the canned goods section, holding what looked like a requisition form and a pen. In the dim light of a pocket flashlight, Thomas couldn't make out the face, but he could see the uniform. Officer's khakis, the insignia of a lieutenant commander. The figure was counting, writing, moving methodically through the inventory with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. Thomas watched for 3 minutes. Then the figure folded the requisition form, pocketed it, and left the cold storage unit. The warehouse door closed. The sedan's engine started. The vehicle drove away. Thomas waited 5 full minutes before moving. Then he went to the cold storage unit and began counting. 12 cans of peaches, 5 pounds of rice, 20 cans of condensed milk. He returned to his desk, hands shaking slightly, and opened his unofficial notebook. He wrote down the numbers. Then he flipped back through 6 weeks of entries, looking for the pattern he knew was there. And there it was, every discrepancy, every phantom requisition, every missing item. They weren't random. They were a code. The quantities weren't about food. They were about information. 12 cans of peaches, 12 ships in harbor, 5 pounds of rice, 5th day of the month, 20 cans of milk, 20-degree bearing. Thomas didn't know exactly how the code worked, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone at Pearl Harbor Naval Base was using the food supply system to pass classified information. And Thomas Nakamura, the invisible cook, the son of Japanese grocers, the man nobody paid attention to, had just become the only person who knew about it. The question now was, what was he going to do about it? Pearl Harbor Naval Base, November 1st, 1941. The problem with discovering a traitor, Thomas Nakamura was learning, was that you couldn't just walk up to your commanding officer and say, "Sir, I think someone is using canned peaches to send military secrets to Japan. They would laugh you out of the Navy. Or worse, they would start asking questions about why a Japanese-American cook was so interested in classified ship movements. So Thomas did what his father had taught him to do when the numbers didn't make sense. He kept counting. For 2 weeks, he had been arriving at Warehouse 7 at 0500 hours and leaving at 2300. He had stopped going into Honolulu on Liberty. He had stopped playing cards with the other enlisted men. He had stopped doing anything except working, watching, and writing in his notebook. Chief Wallace thought he was gunning for a promotion. Lieutenant Morrison thought he was just another obsessive Jap who couldn't help but turn everything into a math problem. The other cooks thought he was boring. None of them knew that Thomas was building a case. The notebook had grown from a collection of suspicious discrepancies to a systematic analysis of a spy network operating inside the U.S. Pacific Fleet's primary naval base. He had documented 23 separate incidents of phantom requisitions. He had cross-referenced each one with ship movements, personnel transfers, and training exercises. He had created a timeline that showed with mathematical precision that someone was using the food supply system as a communication channel. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Whoever had designed it understood that military bases generated thousands of requisition forms every day. Food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts. The paperwork was endless, mind-numbing, and almost never audited in detail. It was the perfect place to hide messages in plain sight. Thomas had figured out the basic structure of the code. The quantities weren't arbitrary. They corresponded to specific pieces of tactical information. Canned goods seemed to indicate ship positions. Rice correlated with dates or times. Milk products appeared to reference personnel movements or security protocols. He didn't have the full cipher yet, but he was getting close. The real breakthrough had come 3 days ago on October 29th, when the USS Enterprise had departed for Wake Island. Thomas had predicted, based on the pattern, that there would be a phantom requisition the night before. He had stayed late, watched, and documented everything. At 22:45 hours, the same black sedan had arrived. The same lieutenant commander had entered the warehouse, and the same systematic counting had occurred. But this time, Thomas had been ready. He had positioned himself closer, risking detection to get a better view. And he had seen something that made his blood run cold. The officer had been writing in a small notebook identical to the one Thomas carried, writing down numbers in neat columns, numbers that Thomas had later compared to the actual ship movement orders that had been posted in the officer's mess the following morning. The correlation was perfect. 12 cans of peaches. The Enterprise was departing with 12 escort vessels. 5 bags of rice. Departure time of 0500 hours. 8 containers of butter. 8-day mission duration. It wasn't just espionage. It was systematic, ongoing intelligence gathering at the highest level. And it was working because nobody except a grocery store accountant masquerading as a Navy cook had thought to look at food requisitions as potential intelligence. Warehouse 7, November 3rd, 1941, 1420 hours. Thomas was deep in his ledgers when he heard the footsteps. Multiple pairs. Heavy boots on concrete. He looked up to see Lieutenant Morrison approaching with 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. One wore the khaki uniform of a senior officer, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant commander gleaming on his collar. The other was in civilian clothes, which meant either intelligence or someone important enough not to wear a uniform. "Nakamura," Morrison said, his voice carrying that edge of irritation it always had when he was forced to pay attention to logistics. "These gentlemen need to speak with you about supply procedures." Thomas stood, his heart rate accelerating. Had they noticed him watching? Had he been too obvious? The lieutenant commander extended his hand. "Petty Officer Nakamura, I'm Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum, Intelligence Liaison for the Pacific Fleet. This is Mr. Donovan from the Navy Department in Washington." Thomas shook their hands, keeping his face neutral. McCollum. He knew that name. McCollum was one of Admiral Kimmel's most trusted advisors, a specialist in Pacific intelligence who had spent years in Japan before the war and spoke fluent Japanese. He was also, Thomas realized with a jolt of recognition, exactly the kind of officer who would have access to every classified movement order in the Pacific Fleet. Gentlemen, Thomas said carefully, how can I help you? Donovan spoke for the first time. His voice was East Coast, educated, the kind of accent that came from good schools and better connections. We're conducting a routine audit of supply chain security, making sure there are no vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemy intelligence. Lieutenant Morrison tells us you're the man who actually knows where everything is around here. I try to keep accurate records, sir. So we've heard. Donovan pulled out a small notepad. Tell me, petty officer, in your experience managing supplies for this basement, have you ever noticed anything irregular? Requisitions that don't match consumption patterns? Missing inventory that can't be accounted for? The question hung in the air like a trap. Thomas had 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine everything that followed. He could tell them the truth, that he had been documenting irregularities for 6 weeks, that he had evidence of systematic intelligence gathering, that he suspected someone at the highest levels of command was passing information to a foreign power. Or he could lie, play dumb, protect himself. His father's voice whispered in his mind, you make yourself useful. You make yourself invisible. But another voice, his own voice, whispered something different. Some things are more important than being invisible. Yes, sir, Thomas said quietly. I've noticed irregularities. Morrison's head snapped around. What? Nakamura, what the hell are you talking about? Thomas ignored him, focusing on Donovan and McCollum. I've been documenting discrepancies in inventory for approximately 6 weeks. Phantom requisitions, missing goods, supply requests that don't correspond to any legitimate department or personnel. Initially, I thought it was clerical error or black market activity, but the pattern is too consistent, too precise. Donovan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, concern. You've been documenting this? Yes, sir, I keep detailed records. Show me. Thomas hesitated for only a moment, then unlocked his desk drawer and pulled out the unofficial notebook. He handed it to Donovan, who began flipping through the pages with the careful attention of someone who knew how to read intelligence data. McCollum leaned over his shoulder, reading. His face was perfectly neutral, but Thomas noticed something. The lieutenant commander's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly. Morrison was sputtering. Now wait just a goddamn minute. Nakamura, you're telling me you've been keeping unauthorized records of supply movements? Do you have any idea how much trouble you could be in? This is classified material. It's food inventory, sir, Thomas said calmly. There's nothing classified about canned peaches. The hell there isn't when you start correlating it with ship movements and... Morrison stopped abruptly, realizing he had said too much. Donovan looked up from the notebook. His expression was unreadable. Lieutenant Morrison, would you give us the room, please? But these are my warehouses. I'm responsible for... The room, Lieutenant. Now. Morrison's face flushed red, but he knew an order when he heard one. He stalked out, muttering something about goddamn overcomplicated Japs. When he was gone, Donovan turned to Thomas. Petty Officer Nakamura, do you understand what you're suggesting here? I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm reporting data. Data that implies someone with high-level access is using the supply system to transmit classified information. Yes, sir. McCollum spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and controlled. That's a very serious accusation, petty officer. The kind of accusation that could ruin careers, or get a young enlisted man labeled as a paranoid troublemaker with an overactive imagination. Thomas met his eyes. I understand that, sir, but the numbers don't lie. Numbers can be interpreted many ways, McCollum said. Correlation isn't causation. You're a smart young man. Surely you learned that somewhere. I learned it from my father, sir. He also taught me that when you see the same pattern 23 times, it stops being coincidence and starts being proof. Donovan closed the notebook. I'm going to need to keep this. Yes, sir. And you're going to need to stop this investigation immediately. No more late nights. No more watching the warehouses. No more documenting anything beyond your official duties. Do you understand? Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sir, with respect. Do you understand, petty officer? Yes, sir. Good. Donovan tucked the notebook under his arm. We'll take it from here. This conversation never happened. You never showed me this notebook. You go back to counting cans and keeping the officers fed. Clear? Clear, sir. Donovan and McCollum turned to leave, but at the door, Donovan paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Nakamura, good work. Your father taught you well. Then they were gone, leaving Thomas alone in the warehouse with the sound of his own heartbeat and the growing certainty that he had just made a terrible mistake. Barracks 14, November 5th, 1941, 2130. Hours. Thomas lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling while 20 other men snored, farted, and muttered in their sleep around him. The barracks smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and the peculiar staleness of too many bodies in too small a space, and he couldn't sleep. Hadn't slept properly in 2 days. Something was wrong. He felt it in his bones in the same way his father could sense when a supplier was cheating them or when a customer's check was going to bounce. Donovan and McCollum had taken his notebook. They had told him to stand down. They had promised to take it from here. But nothing had happened. No investigation, no additional security, no changes to supply procedures. The phantom requisitions had continued. He had checked, despite orders not to. The pattern was still there, still operating with clockwork precision. Either Donovan and McCollum were conducting the most discreet investigation in military history, or something else was happening. Thomas rolled over, trying to quiet his mind. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe naval intelligence operated on timescales that a 22-year-old cook couldn't understand. Maybe they were watching, waiting, gathering more evidence before making arrests. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept him awake, maybe the fox had been invited into the hen house to investigate missing chickens. He thought about McCollum, the man's perfect composure, his fluent Japanese, his years of service in Tokyo, his intimate knowledge of Pacific intelligence operations, his access to every classified order in the Pacific Fleet, his convenient presence during an routine audit of supply chain security. Thomas sat up in his bunk, his mind racing. What if the audit wasn't routine? What if someone else had noticed the discrepancies and sent Donovan to investigate? What if McCollum had volunteered to help specifically to find out how much had been discovered? What if Thomas had just handed all his evidence to the very man he was supposed to be investigating? He swung his legs out of the bunk, his hands shaking slightly. He needed proof, real proof, not correlations and patterns, but hard evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Evidence that he could take directly to Admiral Kimmel or to someone in Washington who wasn't already compromised. But how? His notebook was gone. Donovan had ordered him to stop investigating. If he got caught disobeying a direct order from naval intelligence, they would court-martial him so fast his head would spin, unless he found something so damning that it didn't matter. Thomas stood and walked to the window. Outside, the lights of Pearl Harbor sparkled across the dark water. Battleship Row was lit up like a Christmas tree. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, all the massive ships that represented American naval power in the Pacific. Sit-in ducks if someone was feeding their positions to the enemy. He made his decision. Tomorrow, he would start a new investigation, but this time, he wouldn't document it in a notebook. He wouldn't create any evidence that could be confiscated or destroyed. This time, he would use the one advantage he had. Nobody expected a cook to be smart enough to matter. He would become what his father had always taught him to be: invisible. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, November 18th, 1941. Thomas Nakamura had spent 13 days being the perfect invisible cook. He arrived at 0600 hours. He logged inventory with mechanical precision. He prepared requisition forms for Chief Wallace without commentary. He smiled and bowed when Lieutenant Morrison made his casual jokes about Jap efficiency. He played cards in the barracks twice a week, losing just enough to seem normal, but not enough to draw attention. He was a model sailor, unremarkable, forgettable, and every night he memorized everything. The human brain, Thomas had discovered, was a far better hiding place than any notebook. You couldn't confiscate memories. You couldn't order someone to stop thinking. And if you had spent your childhood memorizing prices, inventory codes, and supplier schedules in 3 different languages, English, Japanese, and the hybrid business pidgin his father used with Chinese and Filipino wholesalers. You could hold a staggering amount of data in your head. Thomas had stopped writing anything down. Instead, he created a mental ledger, organizing information the same way his father had taught him to organize physical inventory. By category, by date, by frequency, by exception. The phantom requisitions continued. Twice in the past week, someone had entered Warehouse 7 after hours. Thomas hadn't watched directly, too risky after Donovan's warning, but he had developed subtler methods. A piece of thread placed across the cold storage door at exactly 17 inches from the floor. A light dusting of flour on the concrete near the canned goods section. A can of peaches rotated label outward when everything else was label inward. Small things, things only someone who thought like a grocer would notice. And every time the signs were there. Someone was still using the supply system. The operation hadn't stopped, which meant either Donovan and McCollum hadn't acted on his information or they couldn't act because the person they needed to catch was too well protected. Or, and this was the possibility that made Thomas's stomach clench, they hadn't acted because they were part of it. He had no proof, just instinct, and the uncomfortable mathematics of coincidence. But on the morning of November 18th, Thomas's careful invisibility was interrupted by something he couldn't ignore. Warehouse 7, 0847 hours. The requisition form appeared on his desk like a ghost. Thomas had been processing a delivery of fresh vegetables when he returned to find it sitting in his inbox. A standard Navy Form 47B, request for provisions, filled out in neat handwriting. At first glance it looked normal, except that normal requisitions came through Lieutenant Morrison's office first with his signature authorizing the request. This one had appeared directly on Thomas's desk, bypassing the entire chain of command. He picked it up, his grocer's eye automatically scanning the quantities. Requesting unit, communication station, Fort, authorized by Lieutenant CMDR, A. McCollum. Items requested, peaches canned, 29 Oz, 86 units. Rice, white, bulk, 5 bags, 25 lb each. Milk, evaporated, 14 cans, 12 Oz. Coffee, ground, 3 containers, 5 lb each. Butter, salted, 7 blocks, 1 lb each. Flour, all-purpose, 12 bags, 10 lb each. Sugar, granulated, 41 bags, 5 lb each. Delivery date, November 20th, 1941. Delivery time, 0600 hours. Thomas read it twice, then a third time. Something was profoundly wrong. His father had taught him to evaluate wholesale orders by asking 3 questions. Does the quantity make sense for the customer? Does the timing make sense for the need? Does the combination make sense for the purpose? This requisition failed all 3 tests. Communication Station 4 was a small radio facility with maybe 15 personnel. Even if they were hosting a party, 86 cans of peaches was absurd. And why would a radio station need 5 bags of rice delivered at 600 hours on a Thursday? The combination of items didn't suggest any coherent meal plan or storage strategy. But there was something else, something that made Thomas's pulse quicken. He had seen this pattern before. He closed his eyes and summoned his mental ledger, the ghost inventory he had been building in his head for 13 days. September 8th. A phantom requisition had included 80-something units of canned goods the day before 3 destroyers departed for Midway. October 3rd. A 5-item request preceding submarine drills. But this was different. This wasn't a phantom requisition hidden in the normal flow of paperwork. This was official, signed by McCollum himself, sitting on Thomas's desk in broad daylight. Why? Thomas felt the pieces shifting in his mind, trying to find their proper arrangement. McCollum had taken his notebook. McCollum had ordered him to stop investigating, and now McCollum was submitting a requisition that followed the exact pattern Thomas had documented. It was either monumentally stupid or it was a test. Thomas set down the form and forced himself to think clearly. If this was a test, what were the possible scenarios? Scenario 1. Donovan and McCollum were legitimate investigators. They had taken Thomas's evidence seriously and were now running their own operation to catch the spy. This requisition was bait, intentionally suspicious, designed to see if the real spy would react to it or try to intercept it. Scenario 2. McCollum was the spy, and he was testing Thomas, seeing if the cook was smart enough to recognize the pattern, seeing if Thomas would report it or stay quiet as ordered. Scenario 3. This was a legitimate requisition, and Thomas was losing his mind, seeing conspiracies in ordinary supply requests because he had been staring at numbers too long. He needed more information. Thomas stood and walked to the filing cabinet where Morrison kept copies of all authorized unit rosters. He pulled the drawer labeled C and found the folder for communication stations. Communication Station 4 existed. 15 personnel, just as he had estimated. Commanding Officer Lieutenant J.G. Frederick Stone, established in August 1941 to handle encrypted radio traffic between Pearl Harbor and the mainland. Encrypted radio traffic. Thomas felt his heart rate accelerate. A communication station handling encrypted messages would be the perfect place to pass intelligence. You could hide coded transmissions in the normal flow of radio traffic. You could claim you were just relaying messages when in fact you were sending your own. He returned to his desk and looked at the requisition form again, this time with different eyes. The numbers suddenly looked less random. 86 units, 5 bags, 14 cans, 3 containers, 7 blocks, 12 bags, 41 bags. Could they be coordinates, grid references, ship identification numbers? Thomas pulled out a clean sheet of paper. This time he needed to write, "Consequences be damned," and began working through the possibilities. 86 could be a bearing. 86 degrees would be almost due east toward the California coast. 514 could be a date. May 14th, or the 5th day of the 14th week, or 05, 14 hours, 5:14 in the morning. 3/7/12/41 could be, what? Too many digits for a simple code, unless Thomas stopped, his pencil hovering over the paper, unless they weren't separate numbers, unless you were supposed to read them differently. He rearranged the digits. 86, 5, 14, 3, 7, 12, 41 could be 86.5 degrees, 14:37, 2:37 p.m., December 41st, or latitude 86, longitude related to other numbers, December 1941. But that didn't make sense either. Latitude 86 was in the Arctic Circle. He tried another approach, one his father had used when dealing with coded shipment manifests during the Depression, when suppliers tried to hide shortages in creative accounting. What if the numbers represented letters? A bar 1, B2, C3, 86 would be... He did the math. If you used modulo 26, it would wrap around a letter H. 5 prayers E, 14 prayer N, 3 Taylor C7, prayers G12, L41, mod 26. OHENCGLO, gibberish. Thomas crumpled the paper in frustration. He was grasping at straws, seeing patterns that didn't exist. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe he was just an overcomplicated Jap turning ordinary numbers into conspiracy theories. He was about to throw the paper away when Chief Wallace burst through the warehouse door. "Nakamura, get your ass over here." Thomas jogged over to find Wallace standing next to a delivery truck, gesturing angrily at a stack of crates. "These idiots delivered 50 cases of canned pineapple. 50. I ordered 15. You think I'm running a goddamn fruit stand?" Thomas checked the delivery manifest. Sure enough, 50 cases of pineapple, signed for by someone whose signature was illegible. "I'll contact the supplier, Chief. Get it sorted out." "You do that and find out who the hell accepted this delivery without checking the count. I swear the longer this war buildup goes on, the sloppier everyone gets." Wallace stomped off, still muttering. Thomas looked at the crates of pineapple, then back at the warehouse, then at the requisition form still sitting on his desk. 50 cases of pineapple nobody ordered. 86 cans of peaches for a 15-person radio station. What if he was thinking about this wrong? What if the requisition wasn't about what was being requested, but about the act of requesting itself? What if the numbers were coordinates, but not geographic coordinates? What if they were filing coordinates? Thomas felt someone click into place. Every requisition form filed at Pearl Harbor was assigned a control number and stored in the Central Supply Archives. The filing system used a multi-digit code, warehouse number, category code, date code, sequential number. What if the quantities on McCollum's requisition weren't meant to be read as food items, but as a filing reference? 86, 5, 14, 3, 7, 12, 41. He practically ran to the filing room, his mind racing. The filing room was a converted storage space where old requisition forms were kept for audit purposes. Thousands of forms organized in a system that only supply officers and obsessive cooks understood. Thomas found the section for Warehouse 8, close to 86, subsection 5, and began pulling folders. November 14th, 1941, 3rd week, 7th day. He found it on the 12th file in the stack. Requisition Form 41, dated November the 14th, 1941, 0700 hours. Requesting Unit, Battleship Division 1, authorized by Rear Admiral W. Pye. Items requested: fuel oil, 4,200 barrels, aviation gasoline, .800 drums, fresh water, 12,000 gallons. Provisions: general. Standard resupply for extended deployment. Delivery date: November 20th, 1941. Purpose: Task Force exercise departure, November 27th. Destination classified. Thomas stared at the form, his hands beginning to shake. This was it. This was the real intelligence. McCollum's requisition wasn't actually for food. It was a cipher key, telling someone else where to look in the filing system to find classified deployment orders. The spy, whoever was receiving these messages, could walk into any supply office on the base, request a CO requisition forms for audit purposes, and extract operational intelligence without ever touching a classified document. It was brilliant. It was simple, and it had probably been working for months. Thomas carefully returned the file to its place and walked back to his desk on legs that felt unsteady. He now had proof. Not correlation, not pattern recognition, but actual undeniable proof that McCollum was using the supply system to pass classified information. The question was, what was he going to do about it? If he reported this to Morrison, Morrison would report it to McCollum. If he went to Donovan, Donovan might be compromised too. If he went directly to Admiral Kimmel, he would be court-martialed for violating the chain of command, assuming Kimmel even believed a Japanese-American cook over one of his most trusted intelligence officers. Thomas sat at his desk staring at McCollum's requisition form and realized he had never felt more alone in his life. His father's voice whispered, "You make yourself useful. You make yourself invisible. You survive." But another voice, maybe his own, maybe something larger, whispered back, "Some things are more important than survival." Thomas Nakamura, 22 years old, son of grocers and visible cook in the United States Navy, made his decision. He was going to stop this, no matter what it cost him, but first he needed to find someone who would listen to a man like him. And he had exactly 4 days to do it before Task Force exercise departed on November 22nd, carrying operational intelligence that would already be in enemy hands. Officers Club, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, November 19th, 1941, 1830 hours. Thomas Nakamura had never been inside the Officers Club. Enlisted men weren't forbidden from entering, technically, but there was forbidden by regulation and forbidden by the unspoken architecture of military hierarchy, and the latter was far more powerful than the former. The club occupied a handsome 2-story building overlooking the harbor with white columns and wide verandas designed to catch the evening breeze. Inside, officers drank gin and tonics, played billiards, and discussed the deteriorating situation with Japan in voices that carried the casual confidence of men who had never questioned their right to make decisions that would send other men to die. Thomas stood outside the main entrance, still in his work khakis, and tried to convince himself this wasn't the stupidest idea he'd ever had. He had spent the last 24 hours trying to find someone, anyone, in the chain of command who might listen to a cook's theory about coded requisition forms. He had considered and rejected a dozen approaches. Going to Morrison would be suicide. Going to base security would require explaining how he'd discovered the pattern, which would mean admitting he'd disobeyed Donovan's direct order. Going to the FBI office in Honolulu would take too long and might not even work. They'd probably just refer him back to Navy intelligence, which meant back to Donovan, which meant back to McCollum. He needed someone senior enough to act independently, someone with the authority to bypass normal channels, someone who might actually believe that a Japanese-American cook had stumbled onto something real. The problem was, Thomas didn't know anyone like that. Until this afternoon, when Chief Wallace had mentioned, in passing, that Commander James Richardson was back at Pearl Harbor. Richardson. The name had meant nothing to Thomas at first, but Wallace had continued talking the way chiefs always did when they had a captive audience, about how Richardson was a hard-ass son of a bitch who had been relieved as commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet back in February after repeatedly warning Washington that Pearl Harbor was vulnerable to attack. They canned him because he wouldn't shut up about it, Wallace had said, lighting a cigarette. Kept saying the fleet was too concentrated, too exposed. Admirals in Washington didn't want to hear it, so they replaced him with Kimmel and made Richardson an advisor. Still around, still pissed off, still telling anyone who will listen that we're sitting ducks out here. Thomas had felt something shift in his chest. A man who had been relieved for telling uncomfortable truths. A man who already believed Pearl Harbor was vulnerable. A man who might, just might, be willing to listen to another uncomfortable truth. He had spent an hour tracking down Richardson's location, not in the main administrative building, not in any of the tactical planning offices, but here at the officers' club where Wallace said Richardson spent most evenings drinking bourbon and scaring the shit out of junior officers. Thomas took a breath and walked through the door. The interior was everything he expected: dark wood paneling, ceiling fans rotating slowly, the smell of tobacco and expensive liquor. A Filipino steward in a white jacket looked up from behind the bar, his expression flickering from surprise to wariness at the sight of an enlisted man. "Help you, sailor?" "I'm looking for Commander Richardson." The steward's eyebrows rose. "Commander Richardson doesn't typically meet with—" "I know, but I have information he needs to hear. It's urgent." The steward studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward a corner table. "He's over there, but if he throws you out, you didn't get in here through me." Thomas nodded and walked across the room, acutely aware of the eyes following him. Officers glanced up from their drinks, conversations paused, and in the sudden quiet he could hear his own footsteps on the polished floor. Commander James Richardson sat alone at a corner table with a view of the harbor. He was in his late 50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent decades at sea. A half-empty glass of bourbon sat in front of him, and he was reading what looked like an intelligence summary, his expression set in permanent disapproval. Thomas stopped at the edge of the table and came to attention. "Commander Richardson, sir. Petty Officer 3rd Class Thomas Nakamura. I apologize for the interruption, but I need to speak with you about a security matter." Richardson looked up slowly. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they took in everything about Thomas in a single sweep. The cook's insignia, the Japanese features, the nervous energy barely held in check. "Security matter." Richardson's voice was gravel and bourbon. "You're a cook." "Yes, sir." "Cooks don't handle security matters, petty officer. They handle food, which, if I remember correctly, isn't what I call a security concern unless someone's trying to poison me." "Sir, I manage supply inventory for Warehouse 7. I've discovered evidence that someone is using the food requisition system to transmit classified operational intelligence." The words came out in a rush. Thomas had rehearsed them a dozen times, trying to find the right combination of brevity and credibility. Richardson set down his intelligence summary. "That's quite an accusation." "Yes, sir." "You have proof?" "Yes, sir." Richardson gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, petty officer. You've got 5 minutes. Make them count." Thomas sat, his heart hammering. This was it. This was the moment when everything either came together or fell apart. He pulled out the requisition form McCollum had placed on his desk, the only physical evidence he had dared to bring. He set it on the table between them. "Sir, this form was delivered to my desk yesterday morning. It's authorized by Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum for Communications Station 4. On its face, it's a routine request for provisions." Richardson glanced at it. "Looks routine to me." "Yes, sir, but the quantities make no sense. 86 cans of peaches for a 15-person unit? 5 bags of rice delivered at 0600 hours? The combination doesn't match any logical meal plan or storage requirement. So McCollum can't do math. That's not espionage. That's incompetence. With respect, sir, I don't think it's either. I think the numbers are a code." Thomas pulled out the second piece of paper, the requisition form he had found in the filing room. "The deployment orders for Battleship Division 1. Yesterday I used the numbers from McCollum's requisition as a filing reference. Warehouse 8, Section 5, November 14th, Sequence 41. It led me to this. Classified deployment orders for a task force exercise scheduled for November 22nd. Richardson picked up both forms, comparing them. His expression hadn't changed, but Thomas could see the wheels turning behind those storm cloud eyes. You're telling me McCollum is using food requisitions as filing coordinates? Yes, sir. Someone with access to the supply filing system could extract operational intelligence without ever touching a classified document. They just need to know where to look. And McCollum is telling them where to look? I believe so, sir. Richardson set down the papers and picked up his bourbon. He took a long drink, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. How long have you been tracking this? 6 weeks, sir, maybe longer. I started noticing discrepancies in early September, small amounts of missing inventory that correlated with ship movements. I documented everything, but Thomas hesitated. But what? I reported it to a Mr. Donovan from the Navy Department and Lieutenant Commander McCollum during what they called a routine supply audit on November 3rd. They took my documentation and ordered me to cease investigating. Since then, the phantom requisitions have continued. Richardson's expression darkened. Donovan took your evidence and buried it. I don't know that for certain, sir, but nothing has changed. The pattern continues. And you decided to violate their order and keep investigating anyway. Thomas met his eyes. Yes, sir. Why? It was a simple question, but Thomas knew it was the most important one Richardson would ask. This was the moment where his motivation would be judged, where Richardson would decide if he was a loyal sailor or a troublemaker, where his Japanese ancestry would either be overlooked or become the reason to dismiss everything he'd said. Because men are going to die, sir. If this information is reaching enemy hands, American sailors are going to die because someone like me was too afraid to break the rules. Richardson studied him for a long moment. Then he drained the rest of his bourbon and set the glass down with a sharp click. You know what I think, Petty Officer Nakamura? No, sir. I think you're either the bravest son of a bitch I've met in 40 years, or you're completely out of your mind. He paused. Possibly both. Thomas said nothing. Richardson leaned back in his chair. I was relieved at CINCPAC because I wouldn't stop telling Washington that this fleet is vulnerable. Too many ships in too small a harbor, no adequate air patrol, no coordinated defense plan with the Army. I wrote memo after memo, made call after call, and you know what Washington told me? No, sir. They told me I was being alarmist, paranoid. They said the Japanese wouldn't dare attack American territory. And when I wouldn't shut up about it, they replaced me with Kimmel and kicked me sideways into an advisor role where I could be safely ignored. He picked up the requisition forms again. So when a cook shows up at the officers' club with evidence that there's a spy operating at the highest level of command, passing operational intelligence to a potential enemy, do you know what my first instinct is? To ignore me, sir? Richardson's laugh was sharp and bitter. Hell no. My first instinct is to believe you, because I've spent the last 9 months watching this command ignore every goddamn warning sign in front of them. He stood up, gathering the papers. Hey, come with me. Petty officer, we're going to pay a visit to someone who can actually do something about this. Thomas stood, hope and fear mixing in his chest. Who, sir? Captain Irving Mayfield. He runs naval intelligence for the district, and unlike some people, he actually gives a damn about security. He's also one of the few officers I trust not to be on anyone's payroll, but the U.S. Navy's. They walked toward the door together, Richardson moving with the confident stride of a man who had stopped caring what other people thought. At the entrance, he paused and looked at Thomas. One question, Petty Officer, why come to me? You don't know me. You had no reason to think I'd listen. Thomas thought about his father, about the grocery store in Salinas, about all the times he'd been invisible, useful, silent. Because you were relieved for telling the truth, sir. I figured you might respect someone else doing the same thing. Richardson's expression softened slightly, not quite a smile, but close. You figured right, son. Now let's go catch ourselves a spy. Naval Intelligence Office, Main Administrative Building, 2015 hours. Captain Irving Mayfield was a short, compact man with the appearance of a college professor and the eyes of a professional skeptic. He listened to Richardson's explanation without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze moving between the two requisition forms spread on his desk. When Richardson finished, Mayfield turned to Thomas. "Petty Officer Nakamura, you're claiming that Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum, a trusted intelligence officer with years of Pacific experience, fluent Japanese speaker, and personal advisor to Admiral Kimmel, is using the food supply system to pass classified information to a foreign power?" "Yes, sir. Based on patterns and inventory discrepancies and a correlation between food requisition numbers and filing coordinates?" "Yes, sir." Mayfield picked up McCollum's requisition. "This could be coincidence, a random match between numbers. I've documented 23 separate incidents over 6 weeks, sir. The correlation holds across all of them. But you no longer have that documentation. It was confiscated by Mr. Donovan during his audit." Convenient. Thomas felt his stomach drop. This was going exactly the way he had feared, but Richardson leaned forward. "Irving, I've known you for 15 years. You didn't get to where you are by ignoring patterns. This young man has brought you evidence of a systematic intelligence leak. The least you can do is investigate it." Mayfield was quiet for a moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. 3 weeks ago, I received a communication from Naval Intelligence in Washington. They've been tracking what they believe is a leak somewhere in the Pacific Fleet. Nothing confirmed, just irregularities. Japanese submarines showing up in places they shouldn't know about. Radio intercepts, suggesting someone is feeding them operational data. He opened the folder and pulled out a list of dates. These are the incidents they've flagged, unexplained enemy presence that correlated with our classified movements. Thomas's hands were shaking as he looked at the list. September 8th, September 22nd, October 3rd, October 17th. Every single one matched a date in his mental ledger. Mayfield saw his reaction. "You recognize these dates?" "Yes, sir. They match phantom requisitions I documented, times when someone accessed Warehouse 7 after hours, or when inventory discrepancies appeared that correlated with ship movements." Mayfield and Richardson exchanged a look. "Irving," Richardson said quietly, "this is real." Mayfield closed the folder. "If it is, we have a problem. McCollum has access to everything: fleet movements, code systems, defensive capabilities. If he's compromised, the damage could be catastrophic." "Then we arrest him," Richardson said, "tonight, before he can transmit anything else." "On what grounds? Pattern correlation from a cook's food inventory? We need something concrete, something that would hold up under scrutiny." Thomas spoke up, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sir, McCollum's requisition requests delivery on November 20th at 0600 hours. If the pattern holds, he'll use that delivery as cover to access the filing system and extract the deployment orders for the November 22nd task force exercise. If we watch him, if we catch him in the act, that's your proof." Mayfield considered this. "A surveillance operation, risky. If we're wrong, we've just accused a senior intelligence officer of treason based on speculation. My career is over. Richardson's reputation is finished, and you, petty officer, will be court-martialed for making false accusations." "And if we're right," Richardson asked, "if we're right, we stop the biggest intelligence leak in Pacific Fleet history." The room was silent. Mayfield looked at Thomas. "You're willing to stake everything on this? Your career, your freedom, possibly your life?" Thomas thought about the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, thought about thousands of sailors who trusted that someone, somewhere, was keeping them safe. "Yes, sir." Mayfield nodded slowly. "Then we do this carefully, quietly. No one else knows. If McCollum is dirty, he might have accomplices. We trust no one." He pulled out a pad and began writing. "Richardson, you'll coordinate with base security. Only the men you personally trust. Nakamura, you'll maintain your normal routine. Process the delivery as ordered. Act like nothing has changed." "And you, sir?" Richardson asked. Mayfield's smile was cold. "I'll be watching, and if Lieutenant Commander McCollum is a traitor, November 20th is going to be the last day he's a free man. Warehouse 7, Pearl Harbor Naval Base, November 20th, 1941, 05:45 hours. The morning came with the kind of perfect clarity that made Hawaii feel like a postcard. cloudless sky bleeding from purple to gold, the harbor still and glassy, the first rays of sunlight catching the masts of Battleship Row and turning them into silver needles. Thomas Nakamura stood in the darkness of Warehouse 7, listening to his own heartbeat. He had arrived at 05:30, earlier than usual, but not so early that it would seem suspicious. Chief Wallace wouldn't be here until 6:30. Lieutenant Morrison rarely showed up before 800. For the next hour, Thomas would be alone with whatever was about to happen, except he wasn't alone. Captain Mayfield and Commander Richardson were positioned in a supply closet on the second floor of the adjacent warehouse, with a direct sight line to the cold storage entrance. 4 naval intelligence agents, handpicked by Mayfield, men whose loyalty had been personally vetted, were scattered across the warehouse complex in positions that looked casual but provided complete coverage of all entrances and exits. And somewhere out there, if Thomas's theory was correct, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum was preparing to walk into a trap. The delivery truck was scheduled for 0600 hours. Standard civilian contractor, Yamamoto Brothers Produce, one of the largest suppliers on Oahu. The company was owned by second-generation Japanese Americans, which had made Richardson nervous until Mayfield had pointed out that McCollum wouldn't use a supplier that was already under FBI surveillance. He's too smart for that, Mayfield had said during last night's briefing. If he's using a delivery as cover, it'll be something routine, something that happens every week, something nobody would look at twice. Thomas had checked the delivery schedule. Yamamoto Brothers delivered to Pearl Harbor every Thursday morning, had been doing so for 3 years. Routine as clockwork. Perfect cover. At 0556, Thomas heard the rumble of an engine. He moved to the window and saw the truck approaching, a green Ford flatbed with Yamamoto Brothers painted on the side in English and Japanese characters. It backed up to the loading dock with practiced precision. The driver climbed out. A young Japanese-American man Thomas recognized from previous deliveries, Eddie Yamamoto, the owner's nephew. 23, 24 years old, always polite, always efficient, always gone within 20 minutes. Eddie opened the back of the truck and began unloading crates of fresh vegetables. Thomas walked out to meet him, clipboard in the hand. "Morning, Eddie." "Morning, Mr. Nakamura. Got your usual Thursday order. Cabbage, carrots, onions, potatoes. Quality's good this week. We got a new supplier for the potatoes. They're coming from Maui instead of the Big Island." Thomas checked the manifest, playing his role. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. "I'll need to inspect the quality before signing off," Thomas said, keeping his voice level. "Sure thing. Take your time." They worked together in the pre-dawn light, moving crates from the truck to the loading dock. Eddie kept up a steady stream of small talk. Gossip about other suppliers, complaints about gas rationing, speculation about whether there would actually be a war with Japan or if it was all just saber-rattling. Thomas listened with half his attention while the other half tracked every movement, every sound, every vehicle that passed on the road beyond the warehouse. At Urso 6:15, they finished unloading. Thomas signed the manifest. Eddie climbed back into the truck. "See you next week, Mr. Nakamura." "See you, Eddie." The truck pulled away, leaving Thomas alone on the loading dock with 30 crates of vegetables and a growing sense that he had been completely wrong about everything. No McCollum, no coded exchange, no spycraft, just a normal delivery on a normal Thursday morning. Thomas felt his stomach twist. Had he just destroyed his career over paranoid pattern recognition? Had he dragged Richardson and Mayfield into a wild goose chase based on nothing but... The sound of a car engine cut through his thoughts. Thomas turned to see a black sedan pulling into the warehouse complex. Not the main entrance, the side access road that led to the cold storage units. The same road he had seen McCollum use 6 weeks ago during his midnight visit. The sedan stopped, the engine cut off. A figure emerged wearing khaki officer's uniform, a briefcase in one hand. Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum. Thomas's pulse accelerated. He forced himself to move naturally, picking up a crate of cabbage and carrying it toward the storage area. Just another cook doing his job. McCollum walked past him without acknowledgement, heading directly for the cold storage entrance. He produced a key he shouldn't have, because only supply officers were issued cold storage keys, and unlocked the door. Thomas set down the crate and moved quietly to a position where he could see through the gap in the doorway without being visible himself. McCollum was inside, standing in front of the filing cabinet where old requisition forms were stored. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small camera, the kind used for document photography. Then he opened the filing cabinet and began systematically photographing forms, not the recent forms, the classified deployment orders buried in the archives. Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear, the doubt, the second-guessing, all of it evaporated. He had been right. The pattern was real. And now he was watching it unfold exactly as he had predicted. He needed to signal Mayfield and Richardson. The plan was for Thomas to turn on the loading dock light, visible from their position, if McCollum arrived. But McCollum was already inside, already photographing documents. And if Thomas moved now, he might be seen. The decision was taken out of his hands. "Well, well," said a voice behind him. "The invisible cook who sees too much." Thomas spun around. Mr. Donovan stood 3 feet away, his expression pleasant and cold. In his right hand was a pistol, pointed casually at Thomas's chest. "Mr. Donovan," Thomas said, his mouth dry. "I didn't hear you arrive." That was the idea. "You know, Nakamura, you're a very inconvenient young man. Most people, when they're told to stop investigating something, have the good sense to stay stopped. I don't know what you're talking about." "Please. You think we didn't know you went to Richardson? You think we didn't anticipate that a stubborn little grocer's son might try to play hero?" Donovan stepped closer. "McCollum told me you were smart. Too smart for your own good." Thomas's mind raced. Donovan and McCollum were working together, which meant this wasn't just a rogue intelligence officer. It was a network. "How many of you are there?" Thomas asked, buying time, praying that Mayfield and Richardson could see what was happening. "Enough. You'd be surprised how many people in the Pacific Fleet believe that war with Japan is not only inevitable, but necessary. And if that war is going to happen, it should happen on our terms, with Japan committed to a course of action they can't back away from." Donovan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're not traitors, Nakamura. We're realists. We're giving Japan enough intelligence to make them confident enough to attack, and when they do, America will finally wake up and commit to total war. No more negotiations, no more appeasement, just victory. You're going to let American sailors die. Some sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. Roosevelt knows it, we know it. Hell, even Richardson suspects it, though he'd never admit it. You're insane. We're patriots." Donovan gestured with the pistol. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk very quietly into that cold storage unit with me. McCollum will finish his work, and then we're going to have a very unfortunate accident involving a cook who fell and hit his head in a cold storage unit. Tragic. But these things happen." Thomas calculated the distance between them. Donovan was maybe 8 feet away, too far to rush without getting shot, and even if Thomas could somehow overpower him, McCollum was armed too, and Thomas was a cook who had never fired a weapon in anger. He needed more time. "The deployment orders you're photographing," Thomas said, "the November 22nd exercise. You're going to give those to the Japanese." "Very good. And when a Japanese submarine happens to intercept that task force, purely by coincidence, of course, it will be one more provocation, one more push toward the war we need. Captain Mayfield knows everything. You kill me and he'll—" "Mayfield is watching the wrong warehouse," Donovan interrupted. "We've been feeding him bad information all morning. He's currently staking out Warehouse 3, waiting for a meeting that's never going to happen. By the time he realizes he's been played, we'll be, long gone, and you'll be a very cold corpse." Thomas felt despair settle into his bones. He had been so careful, so methodical, but Donovan and McCollum had been at this game longer than he'd been alive. They had outmaneuvered him at every turn. "Move," Donovan said, gesturing with the gun, "into the cold storage, now." Thomas had no choice. He walked toward the cold storage entrance, his mind frantically searching for options and finding none. He was 3 steps from the door when a voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, drop your weapon." Thomas dove sideways on instinct as Donovan spun toward the voice. There was a gunshot, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, and then chaos erupted. Men in suits emerged from behind crates and vehicles, weapons drawn, but they weren't Navy intelligence. The badges they wore said FBI. Donovan fired twice more, backing toward the cold storage unit. Thomas heard someone grunt in pain. One of the FBI agents going down. Inside the cold storage, McCollum appeared in the doorway, his own pistol drawn. He assessed the situation in a split second, grabbed Donovan by the arm, and dragged him inside. The heavy door slammed shut. Thomas lay on the concrete, his ears ringing, trying to process what had just happened. Someone grabbed his shoulder, one of the FBI agents, pulling him to cover behind a stack of potato sacks. "Stay down, son. Stay down." More gunshots. The FBI agents were firing at the cold storage door, but it was reinforced steel designed to keep temperature in. The bullets sparked off the metal without penetrating. Then Thomas heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of an engine starting inside the cold storage unit. "They have a vehicle in there?" someone shouted. Thomas understood instantly. The cold storage unit had a rear exit, a loading door designed for truck access. If Donovan and McCollum had positioned a getaway vehicle inside beforehand, they could escape while the FBI was focused on the front entrance. "The back!" Thomas yelled. "There's a rear loading door." But it was too late. Thomas heard tires squealing, heard the crash of a door being forced open, heard the engine noise receding. The FBI agents ran for their vehicles, but Thomas knew it was futile. By the time they got organized, Donovan and McCollum would be miles away, disappearing into the civilian population of Honolulu, where two men in civilian clothes could vanish in minutes. Thomas sat on the cold concrete, his hands shaking, and tried to understand what had just happened. The FBI. Not naval intelligence. The FBI had been watching, which meant Nakamura. He looked up to see Commander Richardson running toward him, Captain Mayfield close behind. They weren't coming from Warehouse 3. They were coming from the administrative building. Richardson grabbed his shoulder. "Are you hit?" "No, sir, I'm fine, but Donovan and McCollum, they escaped. They had a car. In the cold storage unit, they went out the back. Mayfield was already on a radio, barking orders. All units, suspects fled in a dark sedan heading toward Honolulu. Likely civilian clothes, armed and dangerous. I want roadblocks on every route off this base and every road into town. Move." He turned to Thomas. Did they get the documents?" Thomas felt his stomach drop. In the chaos, he had forgotten. "Yes, sir. McCollum was photographing deployment orders when Donovan arrived. He had a camera. He must have the film with him." Richardson swore quietly and viciously. An FBI agent approached, older, with the bearing of someone in charge. "Commander Richardson, Captain Mayfield, Special Agent Robert Shivers, FBI Honolulu office. We've been conducting surveillance on Lieutenant Commander McCollum for the past week based on intelligence provided by Naval Intelligence, Washington. We weren't informed that you were conducting a parallel operation." Mayfield's expression was thunderous. "Because we didn't know you were involved, and because someone has been feeding Donovan information about our movements." "Clearly." Shivers looked at Thomas. "You're you Petty Officer Nakamura, the cook who discovered the supply pattern?" "Yes, sir." "Good work. Your information correlated with intercepts we've been tracking from a Japanese intelligence network in Honolulu. We now believe McCollum and Donovan have been running a cell here for at least 6 months, possibly longer." "Running it for what purpose?" Richardson demanded. Shivers' expression was grim. "We're still piecing it together. But based on the intelligence we've gathered, we believe they're not traditional espionage agents. They're something worse. Worse than spies. They're ideologues, true believers in something they're calling strategic provocation. The theory is that America needs to be shocked into total war mobilization. They believe Japan won't attack unless they're confident of success. So they've been feeding Japanese intelligence just enough real information to make them overconfident." Thomas felt sick. Donovan said the same thing. He said they were patriots, that they wanted Japan to attack so America would wake up. Richardson's face had gone pale. "They're engineering a war." "Worse," Shivers said. "They're engineering a disaster. If Japan believes they have accurate intelligence on our fleet dispositions, our defensive capabilities, our response protocols, they'll plan their attack based on that information. And if that attack succeeds because we've been compromised from within—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. Mayfield grabbed Shivers by the arm. We need to assume those deployment orders are already compromised. We need to scrub the November 22nd exercise and implement new security protocols across the entire fleet. Now, today. Agreed. I'll coordinate with Admiral Kimmel. And we need to find Donovan and McCollum before they can transmit what they photographed. Shivers shook his head. They won't transmit from here. Too risky. They'll run for a safe house, develop the film, and get it to their Japanese contacts through a cutout. We have maybe 12 hours before that intelligence reaches Tokyo. An FBI agent ran up, breathing hard. Sir, we found their vehicle, abandoned 2 blocks from the main gate. They switched cars. We're canvassing the area, but they're gone. Shivers finished. Damn it. Thomas stood up, his legs unsteady. His mind was racing, trying to think like a grocer, trying to find the pattern. Sir, he said quietly, if they're running, they need somewhere safe, somewhere they can develop film, make contact with their network, and escape Oahu before we lock down the island. Every FBI agent and shore patrol officer on this island is looking for them, Shivers said. We'll find them. With respect, sir, I don't think you will, not in time. Thomas took a breath. But I think I know someone who might know where they'd go. Richardson turned to him. Who? Eddie Yamamoto, the delivery driver. His truck left here 15 minutes before Donovan and McCollum arrived. That timing. It's too perfect to be coincidence. I think he was the signal. His delivery told them the coast was clear. Mayfield frowned. The FBI has been watching Yamamoto brothers for months. They're clean. Second-generation Americans, no ties to Japanese intelligence. Then maybe it's not the company, Thomas said. Maybe it's just Eddie, or maybe someone is using him without his knowledge. But that delivery truck, it has access to every military installation on this island. It's the perfect cover for moving information. Shivers and Mayfield exchanged glances. It's worth checking, Shivers said. Where would we find Eddie Yamamoto at? He checked his watch. 0645 on a Thursday morning. Making deliveries, Thomas said. He has a route. Schofield Barracks, then Hickam Field, then back to the warehouse in Honolulu. If we move fast, we can intercept him at Schofield. Richardson was already moving. I'll get a car. Mayfield, coordinate with Shore Patrol. I want Eddie Yamamoto detained the second we find him. Shivers, your men should... Already on it, Shivers said, gesturing to his agents. We'll take 2 vehicles. Nakamura, you're with us. You know what Yamamoto looks like, and he might talk to you. Thomas nodded, his heart pounding. 5 minutes ago, he'd been certain he was about to die. Now he was being pulled into the chase. As they ran for the vehicles, Richardson grabbed his arm. Nakamura, if you're right about this, if we catch them because of you, you'll have done something extraordinary. And if I'm wrong, sir, Richardson's smile was grim, then we've lost 12 hours we didn't have to spare, and American sailors are going to pay the price. They piled into the cars and roared out of the warehouse complex, sirens wailing, racing against a clock that was already running out. Behind them, the sun continued to rise over Pearl Harbor, painting Battleship Row in gold and crimson. In 6 days, that same harbor would be painted in fire and blood. But none of them knew that yet. All they knew was that somewhere in Honolulu, 2 traitors were running with intelligence that could tip the balance of an entire war. And Thomas Nakamura, the invisible cook, had just become the most important man in the Pacific Fleet's hunt to stop them. Schofield Barracks, Oahu, November 20th, 1941. Served 7:20 hours. The convoy of FBI vehicles and Navy staff cars screamed through the early morning traffic on Kamehameha Highway, scattering civilian vehicles like startled birds. Thomas sat in the back of Special Agent Shivers' black Ford, watching the pineapple fields blur past and trying to keep his breathing steady. Everything had changed in the span of 30 minutes. He was no longer an invisible cook keeping quiet records. He was a witness in a federal espionage investigation. And if he was wrong about Eddie Yamamoto, if this was another dead end, the 12 hours they had to find Donovan and McCollum would shrink to 11, then 10, then 0. Richardson's car pulled alongside theirs at a traffic light. Through the window, Thomas could see the commander's jaw set in determination, his hands gripping the dashboard. Captain Mayfield was on the radio in the passenger seat, coordinating with every security checkpoint on the island. All units, be advised, suspects are armed and extremely dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum, 5'10", brown hair, age 38. Kenneth Donovan, 6 feet, gray hair, age 45. Both likely in civilian clothes. Approach with caution. Shoot to kill if they resist arrest. Shoot to kill. Thomas felt the weight of those words. 2 days ago, McCollum had been a respected intelligence officer. Now he was a fugitive who would be shot on sight. How did someone make that journey? How did a man who had sworn an oath to defend his country end up betraying it? Penny for your thoughts, petty officer. Thomas looked up to find Shivers watching him in the rearview mirror. I was wondering why they did it, sir. McCollum and Donovan. What makes someone betray their country? Shivers was quiet for a moment, his eyes back on the road. In my experience, there are only 3 reasons people commit treason: money, ideology, or coercion. Donovan and McCollum don't need money. They're both from wealthy families, and nobody's coercing them, which leaves ideology. They think they're patriots, the most dangerous kind. A man who betrays his country for money can be bought back. A man who betrays out of fear can be reasoned with. But a man who believes he's serving a higher purpose, he'll burn the world down and call it salvation. The convoy turned onto the main road leading to Schofield Barracks, the largest army installation on Oahu, home to more than 15,000 soldiers. The gates were ahead, manned by military police who waved them through without slowing. Where does Yamamoto make his delivery? Shivers asked. Thomas pulled out the mental schedule he had memorized from weeks of processing delivery manifest. The main mess hall, east side of the base. He usually arrives between 07:15 and 07:30. Shivers checked his watch. 07:22. We might be in time. They roared through the base, past barracks buildings and parade grounds where soldiers were beginning morning calisthenics. The mess hall appeared ahead, a long, low building with loading docks on the side. And there, backed up to the dock, was the green Yamamoto Brothers delivery truck. That's him, Thomas said. Shivers grabbed his radio. All units, target vehicle located. East Mess Hall, Schofield Barracks. Approach quietly. We don't want to spook him if he's involved, and we don't want to traumatize an innocent civilian if he's not. The vehicles pulled into position surrounding the mess hall, blocking all exits. FBI agents and Navy Shore Patrol emerged, weapons drawn but held low. Thomas climbed out, his legs unsteady. Through the open loading dock, he could see Eddie Yamamoto talking with an army cook, the two of them laughing about something while they unloaded crates of vegetables. It looked completely innocent, normal. Just another delivery on just another Thursday morning. Maybe Thomas had been wrong. Maybe the paranoia had finally gotten to him. Maybe Eddie was exactly what he appeared to be, a decent kid doing his job. Shivers approached the loading dock, his FBI badge held high. Eddie Yamamoto. Eddie turned, his smile fading when he saw the badge and the armed men. Yes, sir, is something wrong? I need you to step away from the truck and put your hands where I can see them. What? Why, what's happening? The army cook backed away slowly, hands raised. Eddie stood frozen, confusion and fear washing across his face. Sir, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just making deliveries. Hands where I can see them, Mr. Yamamoto, now. Eddie raised his hands slowly. Okay. I'm cooperating. Just please tell me what this is about. Shivers gestured to 2 agents who moved forward and began patting Eddie down. No weapons. They checked his pockets, a wallet, some delivery receipts, a pack of gum. Nothing suspicious. Check the truck, Shivers ordered. Agents swarmed over the vehicle, opening every compartment, moving aside crates, checking under the seats and behind the dashboard. 5 minutes of intensive searching produced nothing but vegetables and delivery paperwork. Shivers turned to Thomas, his expression questioning. Thomas felt his certainty crumbling. He had been so sure. The timing, the pattern, the perfect cover of a delivery truck, but there was nothing here, nothing. Sir, one of the FBI agents called out. He was standing at the back of the truck, holding up a crate of cabbage. There's a false bottom in this crate. Hidden compartment? Shivers moved quickly. The agent tipped the crate and a small package slid out, wrapped in oilcloth about the size of a hardcover book. Shivers unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a camera. Not Eddie's camera. A different model, expensive, the kind used for document photography. The same kind McCollum had been using. Eddie's face went pale. I don't know what that is. I've never seen it before. Someone must have put it there when I wasn't looking. When were you last away from your truck? Shivers asked. At the last delivery, Pearl Harbor. I was inside for maybe 10 minutes, signing paperwork with Mr. Nakamura. 10 minutes. More than enough time for someone to plant a camera in a hidden compartment. Thomas felt the pieces sliding into place. Eddie wasn't the spy. Eddie was the courier, and he didn't even know it. Mr. Yamamoto, Shivers said quietly, I need you to think very carefully. Has anyone approached you in the last few months? Anyone asking questions about your delivery route? Anyone showing unusual interest in your schedule? Eddie's hands were shaking. No, I mean, there was this guy, maybe 2 months ago. He said he was with the Navy, doing some kind of efficiency study on supply deliveries. He asked about my route, my timing, what security procedures I followed. But he had credentials. He looked official. What did he look like? Older guy, gray hair, nice suit. He said his name was... Eddie stopped, his eyes widening. Donovan. He said his name was Kenneth Donovan. Shivers and Thomas exchanged glances. Eddie, Thomas said gently, did Donovan ever give you anything, ask you to carry anything? No, he just asked questions, and Eddie stopped again, thinking. He gave me a new crate. Said the old ones I was using were wearing out, that this one was more durable. It had a false bottom for storing paperwork separately from the vegetables to keep things organized. The crate with the hidden compartment, Shivers said. Eddie nodded miserably. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know there was anything in there except my delivery receipts. I believe you, Shivers said. He turned to his agents. Get this camera to the lab. I want the film developed immediately. And put out an APB on Donovan and McCollum. They're going to be looking for this camera. When they realize it's not here, they'll either run or come looking for it. One of the agents spoke up. Sir, if they planted the camera this morning during the Pearl Harbor delivery, they probably have a pickup scheduled, a way to retrieve it before it gets too far away. Thomas's mind raced. The delivery route. Eddie's next stop after Schofield is Hickam Field, then back to the warehouse in Honolulu. If they're planning to retrieve the camera, it would be at the warehouse. Neutral ground, civilian location, easier to disappear. Shivers grabbed his radio. All units converge on Yamamoto Brothers Warehouse, Honolulu. Suspects may attempt to retrieve intelligence package, set up surveillance, maintain distance. Do not engage until we arrive. He turned to Eddie. Mr. Yamamoto, you're going to finish your delivery route exactly as normal. But you're going to have some extra passengers who'll be staying out of sight. When you get back to your warehouse, you're going to act like nothing has happened. Can you do that? Eddie nodded, still pale but steadier now. Yes, sir. Good man. Shivers looked at Thomas. Petty officer, you're with me. If this goes sideways, you're the only one who's seen both suspects up close today. We might need you for identification. They loaded back into the vehicles, leaving 2 FBI agents hidden in Eddie's truck among the crates of vegetables. The rest of the convoy pulled out, heading back toward Honolulu at high speed. Thomas watched the pineapple fields scroll past again, his mind working through the implications. McCollum and Donovan had created an elegant system. Use the delivery truck as a dead drop, plant intelligence in the hidden compartment, retrieve it later when the truck returned to the civilian warehouse. No direct contact, no radio transmissions, no meetings that could be to be surveilled. It should have been perfect, but they had made one mistake. They had assumed nobody would pay attention to a cook's inventory records. Yamamoto Brothers Warehouse, Honolulu, 11:45 hours. The warehouse was a modest building in the industrial district of Honolulu, surrounded by similar structures housing import, export businesses, food distributors, and manufacturing operations. The Yamamoto family had built their business over 3 generations, starting with a single vegetable stand and expanding into one of the largest produce suppliers on the island. And now their business was about to become ground zero for the capture of two of the most dangerous traitors in U.S. naval history. FBI agents had taken positions in surrounding buildings, on rooftops, and parked cars. Sharpshooters covered every exit. Shore patrol blocked the roads at a distance that wouldn't be visible from the warehouse. It was the most extensive surveillance operation Honolulu had seen in peacetime. Thomas sat in an observation post across the street with Shivers, Richardson, and Mayfield, watching the warehouse through binoculars. "If they're smart, they won't come," Richardson said. "They have to know we found the camera by now." "They'll come," Mayfield said. "They need that film. Those deployment orders are the most valuable intelligence they've gathered in months. Without it, they've got nothing to show their Japanese handlers." "And they're arrogant," Shivers added. "True believers always are. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They think they can talk their way out of anything." At 11:47, Eddie's truck pulled into the warehouse lot. He climbed out, moving with studied casualness, and began unloading the remaining crates with help from warehouse workers, who had no idea they were being watched by 40 armed men. Minutes passed. The street remained quiet. Then at 12:03, a taxi pulled up half a block away. Two men in civilian clothes emerged. One was tall and lean with gray hair. The other was shorter, compact, wearing a hat pulled low. "That's them," Thomas said quietly. Shivers raised his radio. "All units. Suspects approaching on foot from the south. Hold positions. Wait for my signal." Donovan and McCollum walked toward the warehouse with the casual confidence of men who belonged there. They were empty-handed, which meant any weapons they carried would be concealed. They reached the warehouse entrance. McCollum said something to one of the workers, probably asking for Eddie. The worker pointed inside. They entered the building. "Now," Shivers said into the radio. "Go, go, go." FBI agents emerged from every direction, converging on the warehouse. Shore patrol vehicles roared up, blocking exits. In less than 30 seconds, the entire building was surrounded. Thomas heard shouting from inside. Then gunfire, 2 sharp cracks that made him flinch. More shouting. Agents flooded through the entrance. The radio crackled. "Suspect McCollum is down. Suspect Donovan attempting to flee through the south exit." Thomas saw a figure burst through a side door, Donovan running at full sprint toward an alley. FBI agents pursued, weapons drawn. "Stop, federal agents." Donovan kept running. One of the agents fired a warning shot into the air. Donovan pulled a pistol from his jacket and fired back without looking, a desperate shot that went wide. The FBI agents returned fire. 3 shots, crisp and professional. Donovan stumbled, fell, tried to rise, and collapsed. The alley fell silent. Thomas stood frozen, watching as agents swarmed Donovan's position. One of them checked for a pulse, then shook his head. Shivers lowered his binoculars. "It's over." They walked across the street to the warehouse. Inside, they found McCollum on the floor, bleeding from a shoulder wound, handcuffed and surrounded by agents. The camera he had used to photograph the deployment orders lay smashed on the concrete. He had apparently tried to destroy it when the FBI closed in, but the film was intact. Captain Mayfield picked up the camera carefully. "We need to know what's on here, what they managed to photograph before we stop them." "Already being processed," Shivers said. "We'll have prints within the hour." An FBI agent approached. "Sir, we found this in McCollum's jacket." He held up a small notebook, identical to the one Thomas had kept. "It's a code book. Instructions for interpreting the requisition numbers, contact protocols, dead drop locations, everything." Richardson took the notebook, flipping through pages of careful handwriting. "My God, this network, it's bigger than we thought. There are names here, other officers, civilians. This goes all the way to Washington." "Then we have work to do," Shivers said grimly. "But at least we've cut off the head of the snake here in Pearl Harbor." Thomas looked at McCollum, who was being lifted onto a stretcher by Navy medics. The lieutenant commander's face was gray with pain and defeat. His eyes met Thomas's for a moment. "You were just a cook," McCollum said quietly. "How did you—" "My father taught me to count," Thomas said, "and to notice when the numbers don't add up." McCollum laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Undone by a grocer's son. Donovan said you wouldn't matter. He said nobody pays attention to cooks. He was wrong. They took McCollum away. Donovan's body was loaded into an ambulance, covered with a sheet. Shivers put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Good work, Petty Officer. You may have just saved the Pacific Fleet. But Thomas was thinking about the deployment orders, about the November 22nd exercise that would now have to be scrubbed, about all the other intelligence that McCollum and Donovan had passed over the past months. Sir, he said quietly, the Japanese intelligence network, they've been receiving information from Donovan and McCollum for at least 6 months. Ship movements, defensive capabilities, response protocols. Even if we stop them today, all that intelligence is already in Tokyo's hands. Shivers' expression was grave. I know. Which is why Admiral Kimmel is implementing new security protocols across the entire fleet, changing codes, altering schedules, rotating defensive positions. We're assuming everything is compromised and starting from scratch. Will it be enough? I don't know, Shivers said honestly, but it's more than we would have had if you hadn't noticed those phantom requisitions. Richardson approached, his face set. Nakamura, I've just spoken with Admiral Kimmel. He wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. 0800 hours. Thomas felt his stomach clench. Sir, I'm not sure. That wasn't a request, Petty Officer. The Admiral wants to personally thank the man who uncovered the biggest intelligence breach in Pacific Fleet history. Richardson's expression softened slightly. You did good work, son. Better than most officers with 20 years of experience. Your father would be proud. Thomas thought about his father back in Salinas, probably opening the grocery store right now, counting inventory, checking the books. A man who had taught his son to be invisible, useful, and safe. A man who would probably have a heart attack when he learned what his son had actually done. Thank you, sir. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, December 1st, 1941, 1600 hours. The headlines in the Honolulu Advertiser were subdued but significant. Naval intelligence officers arrested in espionage case. FBI breaks spy ring operating in Hawaii. Admiral Kimmel, vigilance remains our greatest weapon. The article said nothing about Thomas Nakamura, nothing about requisition forms or food inventories or patterns that only a grocer's son would notice. Captain Mayfield had explained it during the debriefing. Your involvement is classified, Petty Officer, for your own protection. If word got out that a Japanese-American sailor exposed this network, you'd have a target on your back from both enemy agents and American racists who wouldn't believe you're loyal. So Thomas remained invisible, which was exactly what he wanted. He stood in Warehouse 7, processing a delivery of canned goods, when Chief Wallace approached. Nakamura, I got a requisition here from the officers' mess. They need... Wallace stopped, squinting at the form. They need 86 cans of peaches? That seems like a lot. Thomas felt his heart skip, then realized Wallace was joking. Sort of. It's for a banquet, Chief. Admiral Kimmel is hosting Navy Department officials from Washington. Big event. Huh. Wallace handed over the form. Well, count 'em carefully. After all that business with the spies and the coded messages, people are jumpy about inventory. Yes, Chief, I'll count carefully. Wallace walked away, and Thomas returned to his ledger, the official one. He had stopped keeping an unofficial notebook, stopped looking for patterns in every requisition. But old habits died hard. As he logged the peaches, his mind automatically noted the number, cross-referenced it with recent ship movements, checked for anomalies. Nothing, just 86 cans of peaches for a banquet. He smiled slightly and moved on to the next line item. The war everyone had been expecting finally came 6 days later. On the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft filled the sky over Pearl Harbor, and the world changed forever. But the attack could have been worse, much worse, because of the security protocols implemented after McCollum's arrest. The Pacific Fleet's carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea during the attack. Their positions and schedules had been changed from the original plans that McCollum had photographed. Because of the code changes and defensive reconfigurations, the Japanese attack plan was based on partially outdated intelligence. They expected certain ships in certain positions, certain defensive responses at certain times. When those expectations didn't match reality, their tactical precision suffered, and because of the rolled-up spy network, There was no one left in Hawaii to provide real-time intelligence to the Japanese fleet about which ships had actually been damaged, which facilities were still operational, which defenses remained intact. The attack was still devastating. The Arizona exploded. The Oklahoma capsized. Over 2,000 Americans died in 2 hours of fire and chaos. But it could have been worse. The carriers survived. The fuel depots survived. The repair facilities survived. And most importantly, the American will to fight, shocked and horrified and galvanized by the attack, emerged stronger than the Japanese had calculated. Petty Officer 3rd Class Thomas Nakamura spent December the 7th in Warehouse 7, helping to organize emergency supplies for the thousands of wounded. He worked for 36 hours straight, counting bandages and morphine and blood plasma with the same meticulous care he had once applied to canned goods. No one thanked him. No one knew what he had done, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Salinas, California, June 1946. The war had been over for almost a year when Thomas Nakamura finally came home. He stepped off the bus at the Greyhound station wearing his Navy uniform with a petty officer first-class insignia. 2 promotions earned over 5 years of service. His duffel bag contained everything he owned, some clothes, some books, and a single classified letter from Admiral Chester Nimitz that he would never show to anyone. His father was waiting outside the grocery store, standing exactly where Thomas had last seen him in 1941. 5 years older, grayer, thinner from the hardships of internment that the family had endured during the war years. But alive, they embraced without words. Then his father stepped back and studied him. "You look different, Tommy. Older." "I am older, Pop." "Did you do something important in the war? Something you can't talk about?" Thomas thought about Warehouse 7, about phantom requisitions and coded numbers, about 2 traitors and a spy network that could have crippled the Pacific Fleet, about the carriers that survived because someone had noticed when the numbers didn't add up. "I counted inventory," he said, "like you taught me." His father smiled slightly. "And did you do it well?" "Yes, Pop, I did it well." "Then you did something important?" His father put an arm around his shoulders and led him toward the grocery store. "Come, we have a lot of counting to do. The books are a mess since I got back from the camp. You can help me fix them." Thomas looked at the modest storefront, Nakamura and Sons Grocers, the faded sign still hanging exactly where it had been when he left. A small business in a small town, invisible to most of the world. But he had learned something during the war. He had learned that the most important work was often done by invisible people, that paying attention to small details could change the course of history. That sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply doing your job well when everyone expected you to fail. "I'd like that, Pop," he said. "I'd like that a lot." They went inside together, and Thomas Nakamura returned to the work he had been born to do. Counting, watching, noticing the patterns that others missed. He never spoke publicly about Pearl Harbor, never sought recognition or medals. When historians later uncovered the story of the McCollum-Donovan spy network, his name appeared in exactly one declassified document, a single line in an FBI report from November 1941. Initial intelligence regarding supply irregularities provided by Petty Officer T. Nakamura, USN. That was enough, because Thomas Nakamura understood what his father had always known. The most important people in history are often the ones whose names are forgotten, the ones who simply showed up, did their job, and refused to look away when something was wrong. The invisible heroes who saved the world by counting cans of peaches. National Archives, College Park, Maryland, 1991. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a naval historian researching espionage activities in World War II, sat in the reading room surrounded by boxes of declassified documents. She had been tracking a reference that kept appearing in FBI reports from late 1941, mentions of a supply irregularity pattern that had led to the arrest of 2 naval intelligence officers. After 3 weeks of cross-referencing documents, she finally found it, a complete file on the McCollum-Donovan case, declassified after 50 years. And there, in a supplementary report, was a name she had never encountered in any published history. Petty Officer Thomas Nakamura. She read the full account, the phantom requisitions, the coded filing system, the surveillance operation. One, the shootout in Honolulu. She read about a 22-year-old cook who had used his grossier's instincts to uncover an intelligence network that could have given Japan a decisive advantage in the Pacific War. She made copies of everything and spent the next 6 months trying to locate Thomas Nakamura. She found him in a nursing home in Monterey, California. He was 72 years old, suffering from late-stage Alzheimer's, and didn't remember much about the war, but his daughter had his personal effects. And among them was a single photograph, Thomas standing in front of Warehouse 7 at Pearl Harbor, young and serious, holding a clipboard. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "The man who counted everything." Dr. Morrison published her findings in the Naval Institute Proceedings in 1992. The article was titled, "The Invisible Hero, How a Navy Cook's Attention to Detail May Have Saved the Pacific Fleet." It received modest attention in academic circles. A few historians incorporated the story into their broader works on Pearl Harbor, but it never became widely known. Thomas Nakamura died in 1993, his contribution to history acknowledged by a handful of scholars and no one else. But perhaps that was fitting, and because the greatest heroes, as his father had always taught him, were the ones who did their job well simply because it needed to be done. Not for glory, not for recognition, just because the numbers didn't add up and someone needed to notice.